Maya Johnson was a bright and cheerful 12-year-old girl who loved her curly hair. It was thick, beautiful, and a part of her identity. Her mother always told her that her hair was her crown, something to be proud of. She took care of it with love, spending time every morning making sure it looked just right before she left for school. That afternoon, Maya was walking home alone after a long day at school. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze played with her curls as she hummed a tune she had heard on the radio. She was thinking about what snack her mom might have waiting for her at home when she heard the sharp sound of a police siren behind her. The sudden noise made her jump, and her heart pounded as she turned around. A police car had pulled up beside her, and a tall officer stepped out. His name was Officer Brad Simmons. He was known around the neighborhood, but not in a good way. Many kids had whispered about how he treated people unfairly, especially those who didn't look like him. Maya had never had a problem with him before, but today was different. Today, he was looking right at her with a frown on his face. "You," he said, pointing at her. "Come here." Maya hesitated. She hadn't done anything wrong, so why was he stopping her? Still, her mother had always told her to be respectful, especially to the police. So she slowly walked toward him, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack. Simmons looked her up and down, then narrowed his eyes at her hair. "Your hair is messy. It's not allowed like that in school," he said. Maya blinked in surprise. "But I already left school," she said politely. "And my hair is not messy. It's just curly." The officer's frown deepened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by a young girl. "It doesn't look right," he muttered, shaking his head. "You should fix it." Maya felt a lump forming in her throat. She didn't understand what was happening. Her hair was clean and neat. Her mother had helped her style it that morning. What was wrong with it? Before she could say anything else, Officer Simmons did something that would change everything. He reached into his car, pulled out a pair of scissors, and walked toward her. Maya took a step back, fear creeping into her chest. "Wait, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. The officer didn't answer. Before she could move away, he grabbed a section of her hair and, with a quick motion, snipped it off. Maya gasped as she watched the curls fall to the ground. Tears filled her eyes, but she was too shocked to speak. "There," Simmons said, as if he had done her a favor. "That looks better." Maya touched the uneven strands left behind, her fingers shaking. She felt humiliated, powerless. The world around her blurred as she struggled to understand what had just happened. People nearby had stopped to watch, some pulling out their phones. She had never felt so small, so disrespected. And she had no idea that this moment was about to change everything, not just for her, but for Officer Simmons too. Maya stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened. A piece of her beautiful curls lay on the ground, cut without her permission. She touched her hair, feeling the uneven ends where the officer had snipped it away. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The small crowd that had gathered was silent for a moment, shocked by what they had just witnessed. Then, murmurs started to spread. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A woman across the street pulled out her phone and started recording, her face full of anger and concern. Maya took a shaky breath and looked up at the officer. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Simmons crossed his arms, acting as if he had done nothing wrong. "I told you," he said, shrugging. "Your hair was messy. I fixed it for you." Maya felt a wave of emotions: anger, sadness, humiliation. Her hair wasn't messy. It was natural, just the way it was supposed to be. Her mother had spent time that morning carefully styling it, making sure it was perfect. And now, in just a few seconds, this officer had taken that away. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she bit her lip and held them back. She wanted to scream, to yell at him for what he had done. But she knew that wouldn't help. Instead, she took a step backward, gripping the straps of her backpack tightly. "I'm going home," she said, her voice shaking but strong. Officer Simmons smirked as if he found the situation amusing. "Go ahead," he said. "Just make sure you fix your hair next time." Maya turned and walked away as fast as she could without running. She didn't want to give him any more power over her. As soon as she turned the corner, out of his sight, she wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt. The lump in her throat felt bigger, and no matter how hard she tried, the tears started to fall. She wanted to go home. She wanted to see her mother. She needed someone to tell her that what had just happened was wrong, that she wasn't imagining how unfair it was. By the time she reached her house, her mother was already outside, standing on the porch. Angela Johnson had seen the video. It had spread fast, and someone had sent it to her. The moment Maya saw her mother's face, she burst into tears. Angela rushed to her daughter, wrapping her arms around her. "Oh, baby," she whispered, holding Maya close. "I saw everything." Maya sobbed into her mother's shoulder, feeling safe for the first time since the horrible moment had happened. But as she cried, she didn't see the look in her mother's eyes, a look of pure determination. Angela wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Angela held Maya tightly, gently running her fingers through her daughter's uneven hair. She could feel Maya's body shaking with quiet sobs, and it broke her heart. She wanted to take away her pain, to make everything right again. But she knew there was only one way to do that. She had to fight. After a few moments, Angela pulled back and cupped Maya's face. "Listen to me, sweetheart," she said softly but firmly. "What happened to you was wrong. No one has the right to touch your hair, let alone cut it without your permission. Do you understand me?" Maya sniffled and nodded. "But what can we do, Mama?" she asked, her voice small. Angela's jaw tightened. "We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened. And that officer, he's not getting away with this." Angela stood up, took Maya's hand, and led her inside. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling with anger as she scrolled through her messages. The video had already spread across social media. Dozens of people had shared it, outraged by what they saw. Messages flooded her inbox. Friends, neighbors, even strangers, all offering their support. Angela took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. She tapped on her husband's number and called him. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Brad Simmons sat in his patrol car, scrolling through his own phone. He had seen the video. At first, he had laughed, thinking nothing would come of it. After all, he had been a police officer for years, and he had never faced consequences for his actions before. But as he read the comments, his smirk slowly faded. The video had gone viral, and people were furious. Community leaders were speaking out. Parents were demanding answers. Even local news stations had picked up the story. Then his phone rang. It was his superior. "We have a problem." "Simmons," the voice on the other end said. "The department is under fire because of you. People are calling for your suspension." "What were you thinking?" Simmons swallowed hard. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. "It was just a haircut," he muttered. "The girl." "Enough," his boss snapped. "This is serious. Do you even know who that girl's father is?" Simmons frowned. "No," he said slowly. "Why?" There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then his boss spoke again, his voice lower this time. "Her father is Marcus Johnson." Simmons felt his stomach drop. That name, he knew it well. Marcus Johnson wasn't just some ordinary man. He was a powerful civil rights attorney, known for taking on cases against officers like Simmons. He had won cases that had destroyed careers, exposed corruption, and changed policies. Simmons gripped his phone tightly, his palms beginning to sweat. "Do you understand how bad this is?" His boss continued. "You didn't just mess with a kid. You messed with the wrong family. And now, you're about to regret it." Marcus Johnson sat in his office, staring at his phone screen. His jaw tightened as he watched the video of his daughter standing helplessly while Officer Simmons cut her hair. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one was personal. This time, it was his little girl. He took a deep breath and picked up his phone. First, he called his wife. "Angela, I just saw the video," he said, his voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "I knew you would," she replied. "Maya's still shaken up, but she's strong. She's asking what we can do about it." Marcus exhaled slowly. "We're going to do everything," he said. "That officer is not walking away from this." After hanging up, Marcus made a few more calls, one to a journalist he knew, another to a community leader, and finally to the chief of police. He wasn't going to wait for an apology. He wanted action. Meanwhile, Officer Simmons sat in his patrol car, his mind racing. He had handled tough situations before, but this was different. He had never been in the middle of such a huge public outcry. People were calling for his suspension. His name was being dragged through the news. And now he had just learned that Maya's father was a man with the power to ruin his career. His phone rang again. This time, it was the police chief. "Simmons, get to the station. Now." Simmons swallowed hard. He knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. 30 minutes later, he sat in the police chief's office, his heart pounding. The chief, an older man with tired eyes, leaned forward and placed his hands on the desk. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. Simmons shifted in his seat. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he muttered. The chief shook his head. "Not a big deal," he repeated. "That girl's father is Marcus Johnson. He has won lawsuits against officers for less than what you did. The mayor's office is getting calls. The department is under fire. And now I have to clean up your mess." Simmons felt a lump in his throat. "So what happens now?" he asked, trying to sound calm. The chief sighed. "You're being placed on immediate suspension. An investigation is being launched. And if Johnson decides to take legal action, which he will, you might lose your badge for good." Simmons sat back in his chair, his face pale. He had thought he was untouchable. He had believed his actions wouldn't have consequences. But now, for the first time in his career, he realized he was wrong. As he left the office, his mind was filled with fear. The world he had once controlled was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Officer Simmons sat in his car outside the police station, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His hands felt clammy, and his heart pounded in his chest. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle any situation, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't in control. The news had spread like wildfire. His name was all over social media. His face was on the news, and people were demanding justice for Maya Johnson. He had never expected this kind of reaction. He thought the whole situation would blow over quickly, but instead, it was getting worse by the hour. He checked his phone again. His inbox was flooded with messages, some from friends, some from fellow officers, and many from angry strangers calling him out for what he had done. He had never felt this kind of pressure before. Meanwhile, at the Johnson household, Maya sat on the couch, still feeling the weight of what had happened. Her mother sat beside her, gently stroking her back, while her father was on another phone call, making arrangements. Maya didn't fully understand the legal side of things, but she could see the fire in her father's eyes. He wasn't going to let this go. Angela looked down at Maya. "Baby, are you okay?" she asked softly. Maya nodded slowly, though she still felt a deep sadness inside. "Why did he do that to me, Mama?" she whispered. "Why did he think my hair was a problem?" Angela took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Some people don't understand that beauty comes in different forms," she said. "But just because they don't understand doesn't mean they have the right to take something from you." Maya thought about that for a moment, then looked up at her mother. "Is he going to get in trouble?" Angela nodded. "Your daddy is making sure of it." Just then, Marcus walked into the room, his face serious. "We have a meeting with the mayor's office tomorrow," he said, "and I just spoke to one of the biggest news networks. They want to do an interview." Angela nodded in approval. "Good. The world needs to hear Maya's story." Maya listened quietly. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she knew this was bigger than her. If speaking up meant this wouldn't happen to another child, she wanted to do it. Back at his house, Officer Simmons sat on his couch, watching the news. His face appeared on the screen, along with the video of him cutting Maya's hair. The reporter was talking about the calls for his termination, the investigation against him, and the fact that Marcus Johnson was personally leading the case. Simmons swallowed hard. He had never been afraid before. But now, as he watched his name become a symbol of injustice, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't just in trouble. He was about to lose everything. The next morning, the Johnson family arrived at the mayor's office. Maya held her mother's hand tightly as they walked into the large building. She still felt nervous, but her father's strong presence gave her comfort. She had always known him as a loving dad. But today, she saw him as something more, a fighter. Inside the office, the mayor, a middle-aged woman with short hair and a serious expression, greeted them. She gestured for them to sit. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, Maya," she began, "I want to start by saying that what happened to Maya was unacceptable. I have seen the video, and I want you to know that our office does not support this kind of behavior." Marcus leaned forward. "We appreciate your words, Mayor," he said firmly, "but words are not enough. We want action. That officer humiliated my daughter, and he needs to be held accountable." The mayor nodded. "The officer has been suspended, and an internal investigation is underway. But the pressure from the public is growing, and I believe this will lead to more serious consequences for him." Angela spoke up, her voice calm but strong. "This is not just about our daughter. This is about every child who has ever been made to feel small, every person who has been treated unfairly. We want real change." The mayor sighed. "I understand, and I promise you, this case will not be ignored." Maya listened quietly. She had never seen her parents like this, so determined, so powerful. A part of her still wished none of this had happened, but another part was proud. If speaking out could help others, she wanted to be brave. Meanwhile, Officer Simmons sat at home, feeling trapped. The department had turned its back on him. The media was tearing him apart. And now, there were rumors that he might be fired. He had never imagined his career could end like this. His phone buzzed. It was a message from a former colleague. "You messed up, Brad. The whole city is against you. If I were you, I'd start thinking about what's next." Simmons let out a frustrated sigh. He had spent years as a police officer, and now it felt like none of that mattered. He wanted to defend himself, to say he didn't mean any harm, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had been careless. He had abused his power. And now he was paying the price. That evening, as the sun set, Maya sat on her bed, looking in the mirror. Her hair was still uneven, but she no longer felt ashamed. Her mother had promised to take her to a salon the next day to fix it, but Maya had decided something. No matter how her hair looked, she would never let anyone make her feel less than who she was. This wasn't just about her hair anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. And Maya knew that her family wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The following day, Maya woke up to the sound of her mother's voice. "Time to get ready, sweetheart," Angela said gently. "We have a busy day ahead." Maya rubbed her eyes and stretched. She had barely slept the night before, thinking about everything that had happened. But today felt different. Today, she wasn't just the girl who had been wronged. She was the girl who was standing up for herself. After breakfast, Angela took Maya to a local salon. The hairstylist, a kind woman named Ms. Rachel, smiled warmly as Maya sat in the chair. "I saw your story on the news," she said. "You are such a brave young lady." Maya smiled shyly. "Thank you." she said. Ms. Rachel carefully evened out Maya's hair, shaping it beautifully. When she was done, Maya looked in the mirror and gasped. "I love it," she exclaimed. Angela touched Maya's shoulder and smiled. "You look beautiful, baby," she said. As they left the salon, Maya felt lighter. Her hair was fixed, but more importantly, she felt like she had taken back her power. She wasn't just a victim. She was someone who had spoken up and made people listen. Later that afternoon, the Johnson family arrived at the television studio for Maya's interview. The news anchor, a woman with bright eyes and a kind voice, welcomed them. "Maya, I know this has been a difficult time for you," she said once the cameras were rolling. "Can you tell us how you're feeling?" Maya took a deep breath. "At first I was really sad," she admitted. "I didn't understand why someone would do that to me. But my parents taught me that when something unfair happens, we don't have to stay quiet. We can stand up for ourselves." The news anchor nodded. "And that's exactly what you've done," she said. "Your story has reached thousands of people. What would you like to say to others who might be going through something similar?" Maya thought for a moment. Then, with confidence, she said, "Don't let anyone make you feel less than who you are. You are special just the way you are. And if someone treats you unfairly, speak up. There are people who will stand with you." The interview ended with applause from the small audience in the studio. Maya felt proud of herself. She had turned something painful into something powerful. Meanwhile, Officer Simmons sat in his home, watching the interview. His face was pale as he listened to Maya's words. He had thought this incident would go away quickly, but it hadn't. And now, as he looked at the screen, he realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, and for the first time, he wondered if he had truly understood the weight of his actions. The next morning, Maya woke up to the sound of her parents talking in the living room. She stretched and sat up, feeling stronger than she had in days. A part of her still felt hurt by what had happened, but she also knew something had changed. She was no longer just a little girl who had been treated unfairly. She was now a voice for others. She walked into the living room and saw her father pacing back and forth with his phone in hand. He had been busy all morning, talking to reporters, community leaders, and even lawyers. When he saw Maya, he smiled and opened his arms. "Good morning, Princess," he said. Maya hugged him tightly. "Morning, Daddy," she said. "What's happening now?" Marcus sighed. The police department released a statement this morning. They said Officer Simmons has been officially fired from his job. Maya's eyes widened. "Really?" she asked. Angela nodded. "Yes, baby." The mayor's office confirmed it. They said his actions were unacceptable, and they are going to make sure nothing like this happens again. Maya felt a strange mix of emotions. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but she also knew that what the officer had done was wrong. He had to face the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Officer Simmons sat in his small apartment, staring at the letter in his hands. It was official. He was no longer a police officer. His career was over. He had spent years in the force, believing he could do whatever he wanted, but now he realized he had been wrong. He had thought cutting a little girl's hair was just a small act of control, but he never imagined how much it would hurt her or how much it would affect his own life. He turned on the TV, and once again, Maya's face appeared on the screen. She was smiling as she spoke about standing up for herself and others. Simmons sighed and rubbed his face. He had never truly understood the power of his actions until now. A few days later, Maya and her family attended a community event where people gathered to support her. There were parents, teachers, students, and even activists who had come together because of her story. As Maya stood in front of the crowd, holding her mother's hand, she realized something important. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her story had helped others find their voices too. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "I didn't expect my story to become this big, but I'm glad it did. No one should ever feel like they are less because of who they are. And I hope that from now on, We can all stand up for each other." The crowd erupted in applause, and Maya smiled. She had turned pain into strength, and in that moment, she knew this was just the beginning of something bigger.